Imagine being told the universe began not with a bang, not with a loving embrace of deities, but with one God, pleasuring himself. Yes, according to the Heliopolitan creation myth, the first act of life in Egyptian belief came from the god Atum, masturbating to bring the world into being. It was not whispered as an embarrassing metaphor. It was recited, honored, and celebrated in temple hymns as the very spark of existence. For modern ears, it's jarring. For the ancient Egyptian world, it was sacred. The story goes like this. Atum, the primordial god, emerged from the chaotic waters of none. Alone and complete, he had no partner with whom to create. So, he turned inward. Through an act of self-stimulation, he produced two children, Shu, the god of air, and Tefnut, the goddess of moisture. In some accounts, he spit them out or sneezed them forth. In others, he emitted them directly from his seed. The Egyptian word for hand was feminine in gender, which meant Atum's own hand was symbolically treated as a female counterpart. In other words, Atum was both father and mother to the first divine couple. This wasn't seen as obscene. To the Egyptians, it was profound. Atum's act wasn't lust, it was completeness. He embodied both genders, symbolizing unity, fertility, and the power of self-creation. The Egyptians valued balance, and Atum's myth showed that life itself came from the union of male and female principles within a single god. It explained duality, air and moisture, male and female, order emerging from chaos. Priests retold the story not to scandalize but to reinforce cosmic truth. And yet if we step into their sandals, it's hard not to feel the strangeness. One moment you're in awe at the poetry, a god so whole he can create life from himself. Next, you're chuckling nervously, realizing that ancient worship involved hymns praising what sounds like the world's first solo performance. The emotional response is whiplash, reverence, discomfort, and absurd amusement all at once. Now imagine if modern science had adopted this myth. Instead of the Big Bang, textbooks would declare, the universe began when a god gave himself a hand. Picture professors saying this with a straight face in cosmology lectures. The image is hilarious, yet it reveals a deeper truth. Humanity has always used sexual imagery to explain the mysteries of life. So while Atum's myth may sound strange to us, it was deadly serious to the Egyptians. Creation itself began with an act we now consider private and taboo. For them, it was divine order. For us, it's the strangest cosmic punchline ever told. And that, dear viewer, is level 1 of Egypt's horrifying sexual practices. But trust me, it only gets worse. If you thought a god creating the world through masturbation was shocking, wait until you enter the Pharaoh's palace. Because in Egypt, keeping power meant keeping it in the family literally. Royal incest wasn't a scandal. It was common in several families. Brothers married sisters, half-siblings became husbands and wives, and sometimes even daughters were brought into the marriage bed. This wasn't just whispered rumor, it was a dynastic strategy. The reasoning was chillingly simple. Pharaohs were considered divine children of the gods. Their bloodline had to remain pure to preserve that divine essence. Allowing a commoner into the family diluted the sacred blood. So, to prevent outsiders from claiming legitimacy, pharaohs turned to their closest kin. Marrying a sister, half-sister or niece wasn't just accepted, it was celebrated as a way of protecting godhood. One infamous example is Tutankhamun, the boy king who died young. Genetic studies conducted in 2010 revealed that his parents were brother and sister. The consequences were tragic. Tutankhamun suffered from a cleft palate, a clubfoot, and a host of genetic problems likely caused by inbreeding. Far from being a godlike specimen, the golden boy of Egypt was a frail teenager, plagued by inherited deformities. His case is proof that the royal obsession with incest had very real costs. What they saw as purity, we now recognize as dangerous inbreeding, and Tut wasn't the only one. Pharaohs like Akhenaten and Amenhotep III also married within their own families. Cleopatra, 7 centuries later, famously wed her younger brother Ptolemy VIII to maintain dynastic power. What's horrifying is that this was not about love, it was politics wrapped in sheets. Marriage was less about intimacy and more about control, legitimacy, and propaganda. From the Egyptian perspective, this was logical. The pharaoh was both king and gods themselves often married siblings in mythology. Isis married Osiris, Geb married Nut. By imitating divine unions, the royal family aligned themselves with the gods, reinforcing their sacred status. To outsiders, it looked twisted. To them, it was a cosmic order made of flesh. But the consequences were undeniable. Generations of incest weakened the dynasty. Genetic disorders, fragile health, and a dynasty increasingly propped up by myth rather than vitality took their toll. The irony is painful. In trying to preserve divine power, the pharaohs slowly destroyed their own bloodline. Now imagine if modern leaders followed this system. Picture today's presidents or prime ministers marrying their own sisters to protect the nation's sacred essence. It would be an international scandal, a career-ending disaster. But in Egypt, it was the highest duty of a ruler. That is the dark contradiction of royal incest: divinity on paper, deformity in reality. Some pharaohs married their own daughters. Yes, the god king of Egypt could summon his child to the palace not only as a daughter, but also as a bride. It's the kind of revelation that makes modern audiences recoil, but in ancient Egypt, it carried divine logic. One of the best-known cases was Amenhotep III, a powerful pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. Historical records suggest that alongside his great royal wife Tia, Amenhotep also married several of his daughters, including Setamun, Isis, and Hanutaneb. These marriages weren't necessarily about producing children, they were symbolic unions, intended to reinforce the king's divine role and prevent powerful outsiders from gaining leverage through marriage. By wedding his own daughters, Amenhotep ensured that loyalty and legitimacy stayed firmly within the bloodline. This pattern wasn't unique to him. Throughout Egyptian history, pharaohs repeatedly turned inward when selecting brides. These unions served a political function. By keeping marriages within the royal household, they prevented external families from marrying into the throne and claiming legitimacy. In essence, it was a dynastic firewall. What looks today like horrifying incest was to them an insurance policy. From the Egyptian worldview, this echoed their mythology. Gods often paired with close kin Nut and Geb, Isis and Osiris. For a pharaoh, marrying a daughter or half-sibling wasn't perverse, it was an imitation of divine precedent. The ruler, considered the living Horus, mirrored the gods' actions to maintain cosmic order. To the people, it was not a scandal, but confirmation of the pharaoh's sacred role. Yet the human cost was staggering. These insular marriages further compounded the problems of inbreeding. Genetic weaknesses accumulated, dynasties grew frail, and physical deformities became common among the royals. What was supposed to preserve divinity slowly hollowed it out. The irony is haunting. In trying to make their bloodline eternal, they doomed it to fragility. Now picture a modern world leader announcing he has just married his own daughter to protect the sacred legacy of the nation. It would spark outrage, endless news coverage, and instant downfall. But in Egypt, it was seen as wisdom, devotion, and strength. That's the dark paradox of pharaonic family life. What they believed was divine duty now reads like history's most disturbing domestic arrangement. If incestuous marriages weren't enough, pharaohs also staged rituals that blurred the boundary between politics, religion, and sexuality. One of these was the sacred marriage, or hieros gamos, a symbolic union between the pharaoh and a goddess. While scholars debate how literally these rituals were performed, the imagery left behind makes them strikingly suggestive. Temple reliefs and inscriptions sometimes depict the pharaoh embracing and divine birth scenes. One famous example is carved at Luxor Temple, where Amenhotep III is shown in union with the goddess Mut. the message was clear. The king wasn't just a ruler blessed by the gods, he was the gods' chosen partner. Through ritual union, he absorbed divine legitimacy and sexual potency, qualities essential for kingship. But were these rituals acted out physically, or were they entirely symbolic? Most scholars argue the latter. The imagery of divine sex was metaphorical, dramatizing the bond between pharaoh and deity. Priests may have staged ceremonies in which statues of gods and goddesses were ritually united with the pharaoh in elaborate rites. The sexual symbolism, whether acted or only imagined, underlined fertility, cosmic balance, and the pharaoh's right to rule. Why did Egyptians lean so heavily on sexual imagery? Because fertility was power. A strong Egypt required strong harvests, growing populations, and divine favor. By symbolically bedding a goddess, the pharaoh presented himself as the ultimate guarantor of life and prosperity. Sexual imagery was not pornography, it was propaganda of the highest order, wrapping politics in divine intimacy. For the ordinary Egyptian, these rituals reinforced the belief that their king was more than human. He was the lover of goddesses, the father of fertility, the eternal bull of virility. That belief made his rule unassailable. To them, it was awe-inspiring. To us, it looks like religious theater veering into the erotic. Now imagine if modern politicians tried something similar. Picture a world leader commissioning a mural of himself in bed with an angel, claiming it proved his right to govern. Ridiculous? Yes. But in ancient Egypt, such imagery was the cornerstone of royal ideology. It was not a scandal, it was statecraft. The sacred marriage reminds us that in Egypt sexuality was never private. It was woven into the fabric of power, politics, and religion. For the pharaoh, even divine intimacy was just another tool to prove his supremacy. If you think funerals today are solemn and sanitized, ancient Egyptian tombs will surprise you. For the pharaohs, death wasn't an end, it was a transition into eternity. And part of preparing for eternity meant ensuring not just food, drink, and servants, but also sex. Archaeological evidence shows that tombs occasionally contained erotic or intimate imagery. Some scholars interpret these as symbolic depictions of fertility, while others argue they were outright sexual, designed to guarantee companionship and pleasure in the afterlife. In a world where life was uncertain and death was inevitable, the afterlife had to be perfect. That perfection, in Egyptian eyes, included intimacy. One striking example is the Turin erotic papyrus, sometimes described as the world's first pornographic artwork. Discovered in the 19th century, it shows exaggerated sexual scenes alongside satirical images of animals behaving like humans. While not a royal tomb piece, it reflects the humor and openness Egyptians sometimes applied to sexual themes. It also hints that sexuality wasn't hidden but integrated into their worldview even in funerary contexts. For pharaohs, however, afterlife intimacy had a deeper function. Fertility was tied to rebirth. By surrounding themselves with sexual imagery, they symbolically guaranteed the regeneration of their soul and body in the next world. A tomb wasn't just a resting place, it was a cosmic bedroom, a stage for eternal continuity. From the cultural perspective, this wasn't obscene but sacred. Just as crops needed fertility to grow, the king's soul needed fertility to be reborn. Erotic imagery was spiritual insurance, but emotionally it leaves us unsettled. On the one hand, it's poignant Egyptians wanted joy and love to follow them into eternity. On the other, it's jarring to imagine pharaohs decorating their tombs with sexual scenes to prepare for the next life. Imagine if today people ordered gravestones engraved with explicit imagery to ensure pleasure in heaven. It would cause outrage, scandal, and endless social media memes. Yet for the pharaohs, this was logic. If you want eternal life, you also want eternal love, intimacy, and fertility. For them, death wasn't an escape from the body. It was an endless continuation of its desires. If tombs carried secrets of intimacy, royal harems were theaters of intrigue, manipulation, and sometimes murder. Pharaohs often maintained vast harems, filled with wives, concubines, and secondary partners. To the outside world, this seemed like luxury, but inside those palace walls, it was a snake pit of politics, ambition, and danger. The harem wasn't simply a pleasure chamber, it was a political institution. Each wife or concubine often represented alliances with powerful families or foreign rulers. A woman's position in the harem could determine the future of her children, their chances of inheriting the throne, and the balance of power in the royal court. Ambition ran high and jealousy even higher. The most infamous example is the harem conspiracy against Ramses III. Around 1155 BCE, one of Ramses's secondary wives, Taye, plotted to overthrow him so her son could take the throne. The conspiracy involved high-ranking officials, servants, and even members of the harem itself. According to judicial papyri discovered in the 19th century, the conspirators used magical spells, bribery, and sexual manipulation to gain allies. The plot was uncovered and dozens were executed, but Ramses himself didn't escape unscathed. Modern CT scans of his mummy show his throat was slit, suggesting the assassin succeeded in killing him. This reveals the darker truth. The harem was as much a battlefield as the front lines of war. Sex was currency, manipulation was strategy, and one wrong move could cost a king his life. What outsiders saw as luxury was actually a breeding ground for treachery. Culturally, the harem was justified. Pharaohs needed heirs, alliances, and symbols of abundance. A large harem demonstrated wealth and divine virility. But behind the official image was chaos, rivalries, poisonings, conspiracies, and brutal punishment for failure. The women of the harem were not powerless. They were political players, yet their power came with enormous risks. Now think about modern parallels. Imagine a president or prime minister keeping a harem of political wives, each representing an alliance, and the whole system collapsing into conspiracies of assassination and betrayal. It sounds like the plot of a political thriller, but in ancient Egypt it was a deadly reality. The lesson is chilling. Sex and power were inseparable, and the harem was both a throne room and a trap. For Ramses III, it was literally the place where passion and politics ended in blood. To the Egyptians, loving relationship was not just about people, it was about the land itself. Fertility rituals tied human intimacy directly to the cycles of the Nile, agriculture, and the survival of civilization. Without the Nile's flooding, crops would fail. Without crops, famine would follow. And so, sexuality became a symbol of renewal, prosperity, and cosmic balance. One of the most famous fertility-related myths is the story of Osiris and Isis. After Osiris was murdered and dismembered by his jealous brother Set, Isis reassembled his body except for one missing part, his penis. According to myth, she crafted a magical replacement and through divine union, conceived their son Horus. This act wasn't just a family drama, it was a symbolic assurance that life could overcome death, fertility could conquer barrenness, and Egypt would endure. Temples echoed this belief through rituals. Priests sometimes engaged in symbolic acts meant to represent sexual union with the gods or with the land itself. In some ceremonies, offerings of fertility symbols, lotuses, phallic amulets, and representations of semen were presented to ensure the Nile's floods and the fertility of the soil. Even agricultural workers sometimes performed small fertility charms or rituals in the fields, linking sexual energy to crop abundance. The connection between sex and fertility also extended to festivals. Some Egyptian celebrations included bawdy songs, erotic dancing, and even ritualized drunkenness to honor fertility deities like Hathor. Far from being shameful, these acts were believed to keep the cycle of nature in motion. By reenacting fertility, Egyptians hoped to keep the gods pleased and the land alive. From a modern perspective, this intertwining of sex and farming might seem strange, even humorous. Imagine farmers today holding erotic festivals to guarantee a good harvest. But for ancient Egypt, survival hinged on fertility, both human and agricultural. Sexual rituals were not indulgence. They were cosmic insurance policies. If fertility rituals connected sex to survival, propaganda connected it to power. Pharaohs understood the symbolic weight of sexuality and weaponized it to project dominance. Sexual imagery wasn't always explicit, but its undertones were clear. Virility meant strength. Fertility meant divine blessing, and dominance in bed was linked to dominance in battle. One striking example is the imagery of bulls and virility. Pharaohs were often depicted as mighty bulls, symbols of masculine strength and sexual potency. This wasn't just metaphorical, it was political. A king who could fertilize the land and his people was proving himself as the cosmic guarantor of prosperity. To be sexually powerful was to be politically unchallengeable. Even foreign conquest was framed through sexual symbolism. Egyptian records sometimes describe victories as acts of domination using language that paralleled sexual conquest. To defeat an enemy was to emasculate them, while Egypt itself was portrayed as fertile and receptive only to the rightful pharaoh. In other words, military might was fused with sexual imagery to amplify the king's supremacy. Propaganda also stretched into temple art. Scenes of gods bestowing fertility upon pharaohs, sometimes through the gift of life force or Ankh sign, breath of life. And libation streams were common. These weren't hidden images. They were carved into sacred spaces where priests, officials, and the public could witness the divine approval of their ruler's potency. By being portrayed as the literal lover of the gods, the pharaoh proved he was chosen to sustain Egypt. This use of sex as propaganda blurred boundaries. Intimacy was no longer private. It was a public performance of power. Pharaohs transformed sexual symbolism into a kind of sacred PR campaign, one that legitimized their rule and silenced their rivals. To us, this may seem exaggerated. Today's politicians use photo ops, speeches, and staged family appearances to show stability and strength. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh's family photo was more symbolic. Carvings of divine lovemaking, fertility blessings, and imagery that screamed, "I am virile, powerful, and eternal." What we see as propaganda campaigns on TV, they saw chiseled into temple walls. And while our leaders might exaggerate their policies, Egyptian rulers exaggerated their potency. In both cases, the goal was the same: to control the story and to convince people that the leader was the only one capable of securing their future. Not all Egyptian sexuality was wrapped in rituals, propaganda, or royal ceremonies. Sometimes, it was playful, romantic, and even laugh-out-loud funny. One of the most overlooked aspects of Egyptian culture is how ordinary people expressed intimacy through poetry and humor. Unlike the solemn hieroglyphs on tomb walls or the sacred myths etched in stone, love poetry brought sex and desire into the realm of everyday life. Ancient Egyptian love poems, many preserved on papyri and ostraca, pottery shards, reveal a culture that wasn't shy about passion. Lovers described the sweetness of kisses, the heat of desire, and even the mischievous thrill of sneaking away from watchful parents. One poem compares a woman's love to beer, refreshing, intoxicating, and impossible to resist. Another describes a man so smitten that he can't eat, sleep, or think straight, his heart pounding like a drummer at a festival whenever he sees his beloved. Humor also played a role. Erotic jokes circulated among Egyptians, often poking fun at human lust and folly. Satirical papyri sometimes depict gods or animals in sexual positions and comic exaggerations that reveal a society comfortable laughing at sex rather than treating it as taboo. This balance of romance and humor made intimacy relatable. Love wasn't just divine or political, it was human. What's remarkable is how much this poetry resembles modern expressions of desire. The awkwardness of young love, the thrill of infatuation, and the silly comparisons to food and drink are timeless. These poems remind us that while Egyptian kings may have weaponized sex for propaganda, ordinary people simply used it to flirt, laugh, and fall in love. In the middle of all the rituals and politics, there was still a very real human heartbeat. While poetry spoke to the heart, magic was often used to bend fate. Ancient Egyptians believed that love, desire, and attraction could be manipulated through spells, charms, and amulets. If you couldn't win someone's heart with words or gifts, you might turn to the supernatural for help. Magical papyri contain incantations that read almost like ancient pickup lines on steroids. Some spells called upon gods like Hathor or Bes to inflame desire in the target, ensuring they couldn't eat, drink, or sleep until they returned the caster's affection. Other spells involved symbolic objects, wax figures, knots, or written charms burned, buried, or worn to invoke the power of attraction. Amulets also played a key role. Certain charms were designed to boost virility, ensure fidelity, or even prevent impotence. For example, phallic amulets were worn not only as symbols of fertility, but also as magical guarantees of sexual strength. To the Egyptians, sexuality wasn't just physical. It was part of a cosmic network of forces that could be influenced, controlled, and redirected through magic. Of course, not all spells were about seduction. Some were defensive, meant to ward off rivals or jealous lovers. Others sought to bind couples together, ensuring loyalty and passion for eternity. In a world where divine forces shaped daily life, it's no surprise that love itself was treated as something mystical, powerful, and at times dangerous. From our perspective, these spells might seem like superstition, but they reveal how deeply Egyptians believed in the interconnectedness of love, magic, and destiny. To them, the line between romance and ritual was thin, sometimes non-existent,